Hello, welcome back, friend. Tonight, pull up your blanket, let your shoulders loosen, let your jaw unclench, and settle into that soft, in-between place where the room begins to fade and the story begins to glow. I want to ask you something strange before we begin. When you picture a widow during the Black Plague, what do you imagine hurt her most? The grief, probably, the bells, the carts in the lane, the blackened swellings that made whole neighborhoods whisper and cross themselves. And yes, all of that belongs to the story. But the quieter answer, the one history so often leaves sitting in the dark, is this. After the fever passed through, after the priest had gone, after the neighbors shut their doors, many widows were left to struggle with ordinary survival. Bread, rent, inheritance, suspicion, paper promises, hungry children, an empty side of the bed that also meant an empty pair of hands in the field. That is where our story lives tonight, in the long hush after catastrophe. Across the plague years of the mid-14th century, especially from 1347 to 1353, and in the decades that followed when Europe was still counting its dead and trying to remember how to live. So if you enjoy these slow journeys into the past, you can softly like the video. Maybe subscribe if you'd like to wander here again, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time the night has reached for you. I always love imagining these stories, drifting through different windows in different parts of the world. Now, with the candlelight low and the road behind us empty, let us step toward a narrow street in an English town around the year 1349, where one woman is about to discover that surviving the plague is only the beginning. Picture her there. Let us call her Agnes. She has not slept properly in 9 nights. The air inside her house still holds the faint, sour trace of sickness, wool blankets damp with old sweat, rushes underfoot that should have been changed days ago, a wooden bowl on the bench where nobody has touched the last crust. Her husband is gone, perhaps 2 children too, or perhaps the children remain, which in some ways is comfort, and in other ways is terror. Now you know where the struggle begins, not with some grand speech from a king, but with a woman standing in her doorway, knowing dawn will come whether she is ready or not. The word widow comes to English through Old English vidue, kin to the Latin vidua, and farther back to an ancient root, carrying the sense of being separated, emptied, deprived. There is something heartbreakingly precise in that. A widow is not simply a woman who loved and lost. She is, in the language itself, someone left apart. Have you ever thought about how words sometimes preserve pain more faithfully than monuments do? In many parts of medieval Europe, a wife's legal security depended on custom. In England, for example, a widow might claim dower, often 1/3 of her husband's lands for her lifetime, at least in theory. Theory, though, has a way of sounding much warmer on parchment than it feels in a cold room before breakfast. If her husband had held land from a lord, there were dues to be paid. If records were missing, if male relatives challenged her, if neighbors turned greedy in the confusion of mass death, her claim could become a contest. Imagine the scrape of a bench in a manorial court, the dry cough of the clerk, the feathered whisper of a quill, making notes about the future of a woman who cannot read the words deciding her life. And yet she must stand there, steady as she can, naming boundaries, fields, rights, debts. 3 acres by the brook, 2 oxen if they still live, 1 chest, 1 brass pot. Think about that the next time you misplace a password or wait on hold with some modern office and feel your patience thinning. Administrative worry is ancient. Paperwork, in its own medieval form, has been haunting the vulnerable for centuries. The plague killed with terrible speed, but after it passed, it also loosened the knots of family memory, tenancy, and obligation. Who owned what? Who promised whom? Who witnessed the agreement when the witness himself was now buried beyond the churchyard wall? Agnes, and thousands like her, had to answer those questions while still moving through grief like deep water. And just as she begins to understand that law may be both shield and snare, another pressure gathers at the threshold, because the home itself, that tender word, was also a workshop, a farm, a business, and losing a husband often meant losing the shape of daily labour. So let us step inside the house more fully and listen, because a medieval household was never only a place of rest, it was a machine of survival. In a town, there might be brewing, spinning, baking, candle making, ale selling. In the countryside there was fodder to cut, geese to manage, seed to store, rent to reckon, and endless mending besides. The word husband once carried the sense of master of a house, from Old Norse husbondi, house dweller, householder, but that old meaning can mislead us if we are not careful, because wives were not passive shadows drifting behind men. They worked constantly. They measured grain, salted meat, patched linen, haggled in market lanes, remembered which neighbour owed an egg and which owed a favour. Have you ever noticed how the labour most necessary to life is often the labour history writes down least clearly? Picture now a widow in Florence in 1348, the plague year Boccaccio described with such dreadful vividness. Outside, church bells mark another burial. Inside, she runs her thumb over a length of homespun cloth, feeling where it has thinned. The bread oven exhales the smell of ash and old rye. A child coughs in sleep. She counts coins on the table. Not enough, never enough, and decides which can be spent and which must be hidden. Specific numbers matter here, because they make the past breathe. In some regions, mortality may have reached a third or more of the population, sometimes higher in certain towns. Wages for labourers rose in the aftermath because workers were scarce, yet opportunity did not float evenly to everyone. A healthy young man might bargain upward. A widow with children, no tools, and a disputed claim might not. Yes. Some women did seize openings after the plague. Some took over shops, leased plots, remarried on stronger terms, or entered service where labour shortages created room. But many others lived in precarious balance. One failed harvest, one sick cow, one hard winter from disaster. And there was the texture of public scrutiny too. A widow alone could be pitied, but she could also be watched. Too cheerful and people murmured. Too assertive and people bristled. Too poor and she became a burden. Too capable, and someone wondered whether a man should be placed over her affairs. Think about that next time you hear the modern phrase, holding it all together. Women have been holding it all together with sore hands and careful silence for a very long time. Still, there were evenings when even practical worry gave way to a softer ache. The stool opposite hers remained empty. The sound missing from the house was a sound all its own, and in that silence another question entered, more intimate than law and more relentless than work. What did widowhood do to the heart when society kept asking it to function as though sorrow were merely another chore? Now we move from the market and the field into the inner rooms of feeling, though even here medieval life did not separate emotion neatly from ritual. Grief had textures then, just as it does now. Smoke in the throat, wax cooling after a vigil, The word mourning is tied to memory and care, and in many places a widow's clothing, diet, movement, and speech might all become quieter after loss, not always by strict rule but by expectation, custom, and the heavy choreography of communal sorrow. Picture a woman in Paris around 1350, not noble, not famous, simply one among many. Her veil is plain, her fingers are roughened from laundering linen in cold water. She walks to church at dawn, while the cobbles still hold the night's chill. The incense is sweet, almost medicinal. Candles tremble inside chapels. She kneels. Not because prayer erases hunger or fixes inheritance, but because prayer gives shape to waiting. Have you ever thought about how people survive by ritual when no solution is available? In plague years, death was everywhere, but that did not make each death lighter. If anything, repetition deepened the fatigue. The first funeral might shatter you. The 10th numbs you. The 50th leaves you unsure whether numbness is mercy or another wound. Medieval Christianity offered widows an honored identity in some texts and sermons, especially the image of the pious widow devoted to charity and prayer. Yet honor could be double-edged. To be praised for chastity, patience, and humility is also to be quietly instructed not to ask for too much. Some widows chose remarriage, and quickly too, sometimes within months, because survival required partnership, labor, and protection. Others resisted. Some entered religious houses if kin or means allowed. Some became what records barely notice, women threading one more year together from rent, barter, and endurance. There is an etymology hidden in companion that I love here, from Latin com panis, one who shares bread. Widowhood, in the most physical sense, often meant the loss of the person with whom bread was shared. Simple as that. One loaf now stretched farther, one bowl now scraped cleaner, one pair of footsteps no longer returned at dusk. Think about your own evening routines, the mug set in the same place, the message you expect, the familiar sound in the hallway. History becomes most tender when it touches those ordinary repetitions. And what moves through this story, beneath law and labor and prayer, is not just suffering but adaptation. The heart learns strange economies. It finds room for grief beside task, for memory beside bargaining, for tenderness beside endurance. Yet there is one more quiet struggle we have, to enter before the night settles fully around us, because widowhood during the plague was not only about what was lost. It was also about the unsettling freedom that sometimes arrived with loss, and the complicated price of becoming, however reluctantly, the sole author of your own days. By now you can almost feel the strange stillness of a world thinned by death, where fields lie underworked, workshops stand half empty, and the old certainties have cracked just enough to let new possibilities in. This is the part of the story that resists simplification. It would be easy to say the plague empowered widows. It would be just as easy to say it crushed them. The truth, as usual, is softer, messier, more human. Imagine a widow in a village outside York in the 1350s. A few years after the worst wave has passed, she has lines at the corners of her mouth that were not there before. She leases a small strip of land. She hires a boy during harvest because labor is scarce and dear. She keeps accounts with notches on a stick and memory sharper than iron. When the reeve speaks to her, he no longer speaks as if she will soon disappear into some male relative's household. She has remained. That matters. In post-plague England, attempts like the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and the Statute of Labourers in 1351 tried to freeze wages and social expectations in place, precisely because the old order felt threatened by labor shortage and movement. When authorities rush to control wages, you know the ground has shifted. Have you ever noticed how power becomes most anxious when ordinary people suddenly have options? Some widows found room in that anxiety. Town records from various regions show women brewing ale, keeping shops, handling property, litigating claims, and appearing more visibly in economic life. Not because the age became kind, but because necessity opened doors that custom alone might have kept closed. Yet every opening had a draft. Independence could mean exposure. Earning could mean envy. Remarriage proposals might arrive less as romance than as negotiations over land, labour and bodies. A widow of childbearing age could be seen as desirable, vulnerable, useful, troublesome, all at once. The bed she slept in alone might represent danger to some, temptation to others, and hard-won peace to herself. The thing that moves me most looking back is how little applause there was for this kind of courage. No trumpets. No illuminated manuscript celebrating the woman who got through winter by selling an extra crock of ale and mending her own fence. No saint's day for the widow who buried her dead, defended her dower, soothed a frightened child, and still found strength to plant beans in spring soil that smelled of rain and cold earth and stubborn life. And maybe that is why these quiet struggles matter so much. They remind you that history is not only made by kings signing treaties or generals riding banners into battle. It is also made by women who kept going when the world had become almost unrecognizable. Thank you for spending this time with me, for walking slowly through these dim lanes and candlelit rooms, and if you'd like, tell me in the comments which detail stayed with you most tonight, or whether there is a historical life you think deserves more tenderness than it usually receives. And if these calm journeys into the past help you rest, you can leave a like, subscribe in your own time, and join me again for the next story, where perhaps we'll follow another overlooked life through another quiet corner of history. Until then, may your room feel safe, may your thoughts grow gentle, and may the night hold you kindly. Good night.